We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's September 11th here in Seoul. I'm Shin Yeun, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
Happy Monday.
Happy
and
Monday.
Happy Monday, everyone.
All right. Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. We are seeing the death toll continue to rise in Morocco after a 6.8 magnitude quake struck late on Friday night. It was the biggest earthquake to hit Morocco in 120 years, and officials on Sunday afternoon said at least 2,122 people died and thousands were critically injured. Another 4.5 magnitude quake hit as an aftershock on Sunday, which geology experts read into as a sign that tremors will soon end. Search and rescue efforts are still underway, and officials have declared 3 days of national mourning. And a local travel booking platform has found that over 70% of Koreans are planning to go on a trip during the Chuseok holiday. 8 out of 10 said they would travel here in Korea, and the preference for domestic travel has always been high during the Chuseok holiday, as many also have to squeeze time to meet their relatives, and it's comparatively more expensive to go abroad during the holidays. This year, the government has decided to designate October 2nd as a temporary holiday, which gives people 6 full days off from work from September 28th. And staying on local news in Korea, Hwasong City in Gyeonggi-do Province has been the first city in Korea to implement a separate suicide hotline service for residents. As one of the most populous cities with a population of almost 1 million people, Hwasong had the second high suicide rate in the country, and that's why from last July it launched a suicide hotline that not only provides phone counseling but connects the caller to a nearby police station or hospital. And over the course of a year, a total of 269 lives have been saved. And the city has also been holding life protection classes for its officials. This teaches them to identify residents in need of counseling and to ultimately prevent people from choosing to take their own lives. And it's not just Hwasong City that has been trying to bring down Korea's suicide rates, though. Korea's main portal sites like Naver and Daum have also been trying to restrict and better regulate news regarding suicide incidents, mainly because just by reading relevant news, one could be triggered. Daum puts up a caution-needed warning sign on such articles, and Naver is now considering to shut down comment sections in relevant coverage. Now, here in the studio, I would like to ask what you guys think about these measures, starting with you, Cheska.
The government effort and the city efforts in Hwasong City to have a separate hotline, I think is incredibly positive. Expanding these hotlines and avenues for people to actually talk and communicate about suicide or attempting to suicide, I think is definitely important. Now, as for the media and the efforts that Daum and Naver is making, it's such a tricky question because we live in a country where freedom of speech is very, very important, and there have been research that actually openly talking about suicide in a positive light could actually prevent the rate. So screening the articles that are coming up online or disenabling the comment section, I think could have both positive and negative effect at the moment. Yeah.
I think the positives would be that some people, using the strength of anonymity, they would be like writing down comments
very mean things, and we've seen that in the entertainment section where comments have literally led people to death, right?
Exactly. But at the same time, the negatives, as you mentioned, could be the lack of freedom of speech. Right. But these measures are just coming in. Do you think that's enough, and we're seeing it at the most timely manner?
I actually think about the freedom of speech a lot, and a lot of people, say that we are free to say what we want, but I really do beg to differ that we shouldn't be able to say certain negative things that may affect a person's, a mental well-being. For instance, you wouldn't say it out on the street, right? And if you do, you can actually be, arrested for public indecency or creating some sort of scene. So I can't see why this is not something that we could implement on the internet. Now, though this is a good move for the Korean government to move Hwasong City to have this hotline. I mean, I think it should have maybe done a little bit earlier, because this is something that has been a problem for South Korea for a very long time, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Right. And speaking of talking about this, that was our newsfeed for this Monday. But let's now head into our discussion topic, because we are going to be talking about suicide. Because yesterday, September 10th, was World Suicide Prevention Day, a day dedicated to preventing suicide around the world. And this is the first weekday after that day. And in light of that, we would like to shed light on this important issue.
Though South Korea is well known for its rapid development, it still has critical challenges it needs to tackle, such as having the lowest life satisfaction rates among all 38 OECD member countries. And it has a relatively high suicide rate among developed nations. Back in 2021, the suicide rate in Korea stood at 26 per 100,000 people. This was an uptick by 0.3 compared to the year before. And the rate is particularly high among those in their 20s. The country has also seen a string of suicides hit the headlines recently, specifically young teachers who took their own lives.
South Korea, unfortunately, has a notorious title among OECD member states, that is, having the highest suicide rate in the world. Now, I'd like to ask our panelists in the studio what they think are the reasons behind such a high rate of suicides.
Yeah, it's terrible that South Korea is basically topping the OECD countries in negative categories, such as the lowest birth rate and since 2003, having the highest rates of suicide, except for the years 2016 and 2017, around 26 out of 100,000 have sadly taken their own lives in this fashion. Now, according to recent statistics on attempted suicide, we are seeing a lot more cases between teenagers, from very young teenagers up until their 30s. We're seeing it in a lot in the media these days. And sadly, it appears that women almost double the amount compared to men. I mean, it doesn't matter what sex you are, it's still very sad, but in many other countries, men usually triple the amount of women in suicides. And if we just take a look at the screen, we can actually see some of the reasons why Koreans have decided to end their own lives. Now, 31% comes down to psychiatric problems, now 24%. Economic problems, now a lot has been due to COVID-19 in the last couple of years as well, people having trouble to recover. Physical disease problems as well comes in at 18%. 7% family, and 20% other. There are many other categories as well. An example might be gender-related work issues.
And you know what, Walter? I think that it's all intertwined. If you have psychological problems and economic problems all at once, that could lead to physical problems.
Of course.
So that's the really scary thing about this issue, is that there's so many factors behind that, and it's really hard to solve. But would you like to add on, Cheska, on what you think are some reasons behind South Korea's very high suicide rate?
As Walter concisely mentioned in the graph and the statistics, definitely psychiatric issue is one of the top reasons for suicide attempts. But if we delve a little bit deeper, I think we have to think about the circumstances that cause these psychiatric issues and mental issues, as well as how it's taken care of once people go through something like this. So just to point out, our generation is known to have the highest depression rate at the moment. And if you look at the circumstances that sort of surrounds it, there's a social isolation issue that is very big. Growing up in a very competitive environment, especially with prevalent social media, where comparison is so malignant. You're constantly comparing yourself to the highlights and the high standards of other people, that sometimes people feel that no matter how hard I try, I would never get to the places that I want to be.
Right.
And I think this kind of, coupled with the society's pressure to excel, to compete, I think exacerbates the situations and ultimately leads to fatal consequences.
Exactly. The deeply rooted socioeconomic and cultural background pushes people to the brinks of having very low satisfaction rates in their lives, which also causes a lot of psychiatric problems. And it's really hard to just root down one problem because, as we've all mentioned, it's all deeply intertwined. Nonetheless, there needs to be solutions.
Absolutely.
And as we've mentioned earlier in our newsfeed, Korean officials have been trying to bring these suicide rates down. And could you guys introduce any more policies the Korean government has been trying to implement?
Well, as for South Korea, the government is trying their best to obviously take measures against this horrible statistic that we have.
Yep.
Now, there are 4 main suicide hotlines that you can contact, which we'll have numbers at the end of the show. So please stick around if you are one of those people who may need this. Sadly, a popular destination for people for people who want to attempt suicide in Korea is on some of the bridges, and it's gotten so bad that the government has had to start putting up hotlines that are on the bridges as well. But there's also some meaningful messages. If you go for a walk across, you might see on the bridge railings like signs that say like "밥 먹었어요," which means like a term of greeting here in Korea. It means "have you eaten?" which is kind of hopefully going to spur some visions of like their family and like someone who cares for them, because that's what we usually say to people when we care about them. So these are just some of the prevention measures that they have tried to take recently, but yes, there are much more out there.
As you mentioned, 밥 먹었어요, though it's literally meaning, did you eat? I think in Korea it's used like amongst your friends or family, just to check up on you, like how was your day? I think that's the equivalent. But Cheska, could you also shed light on what still needs improvement among all these policies and the efforts the government has been showing?
And I'm so glad that we started our news with the newsfeed, because the government is making some efforts and we're going in the positive direction. However, I think we still need a more aggressive and more forceful investment, because compared to other countries, we only invest about 20% of some what other countries do for prevention strategies. Now, for issues such as these, I think prevention is always more important than having an after effect, because these things can escalate very quickly, and usually people who attempt suicide have a high risk of attempting it again. So one of the things that I think we need more investment is what we would call like gatekeeping. So having officials or professions that are in close contact with high risk suicide attempts, such as school counselors or people on hotlines. I think we need more people who can gatekeep and prevent and educate people.
And I think we are seeing more of that, but as you mentioned, compared to other parts of the world, it still needs a lot more work. If I do add one silver lining, though, is that I think our generation is leading the conversation as to talking more about suicide and the importance of life and death matters, and that it is something that can be fixed with appropriate mental counseling and options out there. But why don't we blueprint off of some countries that have already been doing that by introducing some policies some countries have been showing in the past?
That's a very good word to use, blueprint. So Finland once had the highest suicide rate in the world, which I'm very surprised, because I always thought that was such a very peaceful country. As a way to try and fix their problem, the Finnish government actually led the world's first state-led prevention project, which was carried out to actively discover and treat potential suicide victims from attempting. Now, these ways included like strengthening regulations on alcohol. Obviously, when people are intoxicated, they're more likely to do something terrible, or even the use of firearms. And as we mentioned earlier in the news feed, also on the media as well, obviously trying to not so much ban, but at least lessen the reportings on suicides, as well as things on the internet.
Which is very true, because there is a psychological impact after seeing so much coverage related to not only suicide, but just deaths in general. That does take a toll on you. What about other countries?
I think this is a very multifaceted challenge, and just because it's difficult doesn't mean it can't be done. As Walter mentioned, Finland is one good example. I think first and foremost, reducing the stigma, I think, is very, very important. So some of the countries like Canada and United Kingdom invested heavily in changing the narratives and the norm of what it's like to get counseling, or what it's like to have mental health problems. I think that's a very strong stream that we need to change, the current. Another thing that I think is important is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the gatekeeping, increasing that gatekeeping. So for instance, police and hospitals and teachers, like educating them so they can spot the signs and that they can treat or counsel people who are in high risk attempts of suicide, I think is also very important.
Exactly, it needs to be a joint movement. And staying on the global front, we asked our viewers to share what the suicide rate is like in their respective countries, and also analyze some reasons behind why people choose to take their own lives. Here's what 3 of them had to share with us. Take a look at the screen. Benny said the Philippine suicide rate, the last time I checked, it was 2.5 per 100,000 people in 2019, and that's according to our country's health department. Tasmia said in Bangladesh, the suicide rate is 3.70, and 446 students committed suicide in 2022, most of them being females. The prime reasons were resentment and family disputes. TRSBell 4740 said the rates in the U.S. are roughly 14 people per 100,000 and an average 134 people per day. Men are the majority, as they're almost 4 times more likely than women. So talking about suicide, it shouldn't only be confined to Korea, right? It's a global issue that needs a lot more work, and that is why we're now going to include a mental health expert in our talks to better achieve the objectives of World Suicide Prevention Day, and that's to make people aware of the problem and find effective ways to help stop people from taking their own lives as a last resort. counseling plays a big part in managing your mental health and preventing people from committing suicide. That's why we're going to speak to a counselor from the Torch Trinity Counseling Center here in Korea to find out more about anti-suicide policies and how the country can better improve. It's Christy June. Welcome, Christy.
Hello, thank you for having me here today.
All right, Christy, so the first question I have for you is, apart from all the policies we've introduced so far, what are some other anti-suicide policies like here in Korea? And is there anything in particular that countries abroad could take note of?
Well, yes, the important policies have already been mentioned earlier. Most countries are now aware of the importance of preventing suicide, and countries have a specific action plan for suicide prevention from national to local levels. But most are centered around preventing suicide attempts when it already might be too severe, too late to prevent someone from attempting suicide. So it would be great to have policies and prevention strategies for those who have high ideation, which refers to those who have frequent suicidal thoughts. So those who are at higher risk may have the intent to act upon and have specific suicidal plans. So these would be the warning signs of someone who have plans to attempt suicide in the future. Something that Korea has been doing is they have a policy where they carry out like a bi-weekly mental health surveillance or screening test for fourth graders and for middle schoolers and so on, and even high schoolers. So having some kind of a mental health screening will definitely help to prevent suicide attempts.
Very briefly though, Christy, was that effective? Has that been proven effective?
Yes, it has been proven effective because we can not only screen those who have attempted suicide, but like I mentioned, we can screen those who have high suicide ideation, someone who have high suicidal thoughts and plan. And from that screening test, we are able to monitor those who have high risk. And for those who are in that level of severity, they would need to get mandatory school counseling.
Christy, I'm curious, what are some common factors behind countries with high suicide rates?
Yes, a lot of common factors have already been mentioned, and just for us to keep in mind, suicide usually occurs from different complex factors and not just one, of course. So to just mention someone who has a family or individual history of depression or mental illness, someone who has previous suicide attempt or any form of self-harm, being socially isolated, having high conflict relationship, exposure to violence or abuse, having that financial loss that's been already mentioned, lacking access to mental health care, and even having unsafe media portrayal of suicide all contribute to high suicide rates.
And could you give us one advice or solution to prevent or maybe even, stop suicide rates from happening?
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of solutions to keep the suicide rates down. Just to think of different levels on a national level, having measures to enhance one's mental health in general, not just preventing suicide, will help. Even increasing government funds to support counseling services, which has been ongoing a lot even here in Korea. And perhaps, like I mentioned earlier, making mandatory mental health screening, not just for students, but even for adults would help. Raising awareness of mental health in a positive way to destigmatize the negative connotation that comes along with it, not just taking care of our physical health, but also our mental health as well. And also just want to mention what we can do on an individual level, being aware of your own mental health state and my stress level, and having to have just at least one person to talk to about your mental state. If one person doesn't come up to your mind, be aware that you can seek help to counselors or psychiatrists out there. And it would be best if there's more than one person to talk to, or just even joining a supporting group or community that you can feel connected to would even be a stronger bond for anyone.
Right, and as you're just showing us, Christy, there are English options out there. So for those people who can't speak Korean in the country, there are other language counseling programs available at hand, right?
Yes, definitely. So the one that is offered a suicide hotline or even a mental health services is from a Tanuri call center, which is also funded by the government. So it's operated in different languages, like you mentioned, Korean, English, Chinese, Tagalog, Japanese, and so on. So it would be good if people would able to get access to those help too.
All right, thank you so much, Christy. It was a pleasure having you on our show today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
And let's end off with our final notes. Anything you'd like to say to those out there who are watching today's show and who may be going through a tough time?
Well, I wish I had the answer to, help everyone's terrible situation. It's not easy. Everyone has their very, very dark times in their life, and I hope they understand that, like you mentioned before, we're the generation to change the perception of what, depression and suicide is, and please feel free, to get help. It's not something you should be ashamed of.
Never be ashamed of asking for help. What about you, Cheska?
Christy mentioned some of the most amazing things, but one thing that always comes back to me when I'm going through some tough times is something called the semicolon project. So semicolon is, quote, when an author could have chosen to end the sentence, but chose not to. And I think it applies to our lives as well. We are the author of our lives, and we always have the chance to either end the sentence or pause and then start again. I think that's something that we should keep in mind.
Taking a break in between. And here in Korea, there are many helplines available. Call 1393 or visit 129.go.kr. There's also a mental health center crisis counseling center available 24/7 with the number 15770199. And just remember, feeling suicidal is completely normal if you're under a lot of psychological pain or distress. It's completely okay if you feel weak and powerless. And though it may not seem like it, there are people that are out there to listen and understand what you're going through. So please use these hotline options that are below, as they're free and confidential. And in the meantime, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
And Cheska Dainha.
Pleasure's always mine, thank you.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are News Generation.